And the library had like entire shelves of these things back then. I'm guessing that a lot of these books are out of print. Now, a lot of these books were like very small. They could fit in your back pocket, made with like really cheap quality paper, with titles like You're You, Charlie Brown, or something, 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 Snoopy. You know, you get the point. They were printed in black and white. I remember when I checked out, it was called Good Grief, Charlie Brown. And at the time I was thinking, well, it's about time somebody had a book with that title, something, 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 you know, Good Grief, Charlie Brown, because most of the specials were always something, 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 comma, Charlie Brown. Just made sense to have Good Grief, Charlie Brown as one of them. This one was full of Sunday strips that were printed in black and white, and they were early Peanuts characters. I probably could have mentioned this before in part 2, but when I read that one, I really hated it, because I felt like these were characters that were just, not, they just weren't the Peanuts characters that I knew. Now, I understand that most creations, such as Mickey Mouse, Garfield, look very different when they start out, and then they kind of evolve into something like that. So when I saw this, Good Grief, Charlie Brown, I instinctively knew, without looking at the copyright, that this was super old Peanuts, and I didn't want anything to do with it. Still, I was always interested in checking out any Charlie Brown, Charles Schulz book I could find at the library. There used to be these series of Peanuts Parade books that I would have to assume printed the daily strips in order, but I don't really know. I can't remember if they printed the Sunday ones, but if they did, they certainly weren't in color. The first of these books was Who's the Funny Looking Kid with a Big Nose? And since that featured the first appearance of Pepper and Patty, they must have started this habit around the late 60s. And then there were other collections of Charlie Brown that were had the black and white and the color comics printed in color. There was one I think called Peanuts Treasury, and there was one called the Snoopy Festival, which had pretty much a lot of comics about Snoopy in it. And basically, if Snoopy was in it, chances are it was in this book. I remember coming home sick from school and reading this one, and I remember I didn't really know how to read very well, so it took me almost forever to get through this book that I could probably get through within an hour or so easily. I remember that moment because it just felt like the world of Snoopy just never ended. I was just kept reading it and reading it and reading it. Crazy. But the one Charlie Brown book that I for sure owned, and I actually still have it around here somewhere, I couldn't find it, I probably could bring it as a prop, was called Sandlot Peanuts. And this was a book focusing on Charlie Brown and his baseball team, which he somehow manages and always loses. There's a constant running theme throughout the Charlie Brown universe. It's funny is I have this, I wrote my name on, or someone wrote this book belongs to Mark Rollins. And I think I might have given it to my cousin, and they whited out my name and put their name in it, or something like that. That's such a Charlie Brown thing, man. I don't know why. So yeah, growing up, Charlie Brown was everywhere. I remember there was a series of books called Charlie Brown's Book of Questions and Answers, and I think they had 5 in this series. The format of this is pretty obvious. They'd have a question, and then they'd write out a few paragraphs containing the answer. And along the ways, there were strips that were reprinted that were somewhat related to whatever that they were talking about. Charlie Brown was just there because Charlie Brown, because it just made it fun. The 5th book, it was one I had, and it was about inventions and how they worked. And you better believe that changed my life completely, just seeing that book and trying to read about inventions and how they worked and how it made me really love inventions back then. And so I guess I got Charlie Brown to thank for that. Okay, I think I've talked about this before, that in a previous show, that a lot of shows hit, have I? Anyway, they hit that jump for the shark moment, or that time where they hit their creative peak, and there's not really much they can do with it. It was about the 70s, I think, that Charles Schulz didn't really introduce any more characters to the strip. I was continuing to read it in the Sunday through the 80s, and I'm not saying that Charlie Brown or that Charles Schulz and his comic strip peaked in that time, but I don't really know how to say it other than that. I always associated with that kind of. I barely remember Charlie Brown in the 80s, or I'm sorry, in the 90s, and I'll get to that. But when I read him in the 80s, he was a guy that I could always relate with. Yeah, Charlie Brown was a character that I could relate with because he wouldn't always win. He'd have a certain sense of victory, as in, I believe Linus has a line of where, after he lost a spelling bee in A Boy Named Charlie Brown, where he says, "Did you notice something, Charlie Brown? The world didn't come to an end." Charlie Brown keeps going in spite of his losing. And that's good. He wasn't like other comic book characters, like superheroes, who always triumphed at the end. But he would often get tagged out at the end of a game where he was dependent on, or he would drop the ball that he was supposed to catch to win the game. And then oftentimes when that would happen, he'd go through this serious funk, and you would see him going through this funk. And, I think that's just incredibly relatable, because I think there is something to that about losing that is something that Schulz was really good at talking about, because most people don't like to talk about losing. There's also something about Charlie Brown I could relate. Maybe it's being on the autism spectrum. I'm not saying that Charlie Brown was on the autism spectrum. I'm not going to go there. But I do remember one particular strip that was in the Good Grief Charlie Brown, the book that I said that I hated, where Charlie Brown is basically saying, like, sometimes I just want to be alone. And I felt like that's really interesting. A lot of times in the Charlie Brown strips, the characters are all together and stuff like that. But Charlie Brown admitted to himself, because I guess he was just talking to himself or something like that he wants to be alone. And I was that kid too. I'd be happier playing alone than with kids. I remember that was something that oftentimes, my parents would often say, "Hey, the kids are down there playing. Go play with them." It's like, "No, I'm okay here playing with my toys," or something like that. I don't know. Now, Snoopy is also me. I always felt like, for a dog, he had so much imagination. He was constantly pretending to stop the Red Baron. He was always working on the Great American Novel. There's also something about him that's just really captivating, because no matter what, he was always happy to be alive. But here's the thing about Snoopy. If he's sad, he is very sad. And if he's happy, he's very happy. He feels every emotion to the core, and yet he's always trying to be more than he should be. I mean, he plays baseball, tennis, all kinds of things that a dog shouldn't be doing. And I definitely like how Linus lived his life, just unapologetic about his blanket and who he is. And it's so funny that he's smart and he's wise, and even though he has that blanket, he is more secure about himself than any of the other characters in the strip. And I will have to say that about Linus, and that's what makes him really shine. Actually, you could easily make a strip about him. You could have easily made the strip about him. You could have made him the star character rather than Charlie Brown, who's more associated with him. But seriously, Linus is Linus, and that's why I like him so much. As for Lucy, I think I mentioned her before. I mean, I didn't hate her, but maybe love to hate her. There's a lot of things about Lucy who appears incredibly the crabby menace of the strip, but at the same time, there are a lot of times where you see a different side of Lucy, and that's fine. I actually think Lucy is a very complex character. The one I really liked, though, was Peppermint Patty. So it was always someone I could relate with. She was a girl who wasn't very smart, but wanted to be the greatest at anything that she did. She was kind of a tomboy that way. And I always liked her relationship with Marcy, and Marcy was a force to be reckoned with. There were times where you didn't want to mess with Marcy. You make her angry, she will smack you silly, I can tell you that much. I definitely could tell you some of my favorite stories from the strip. One was one that I actually think Charles Schulz had fond memories of, that I'm told, where Charlie Brown is watches the sunrise. Instead of the sun, it's a baseball. And he starts seeing a baseball in everything, like the moon, even a scoop of ice cream. And then he gets this rash on his head that makes his head looks like a baseball. So he puts a sack on it to cover it. And then as therapy of this, his doctor tells him to go to camp to get his mind off baseball. But then at camp, people see him with this sack on his head, and they think he's something unusual, so they elect him camp president. And anyway, I loved how this story escalates. It doesn't really necessarily have a good ending, and I'm not going to spoil it if you haven't read the strip. But it's definitely a twist in an adventure of Charlie Brown, that's for sure. Then there was one storyline about Peppermint Patty that I swear was probably the longest one they had in the strip. But basically, Peppermint Patty has to enter a skating competition, and she has Marcy design her dress, and Marcy doesn't really know how to sew. Peppermint Patty sees she has a sewing machine, so she cons Marcy into sewing the dress, and the dress is just this thing that just flops around her. It's got no sleeves in it, and so basically, I don't remember how that one resolved, but essentially she has to get her hair done after Marcy gets the dress done, and so she goes to see Charlie Brown's father, and basically Charlie Brown's father thinks Peppermint Patty is a boy, so cuts her hair like that. So Peppermint Patty has this really short haircut, and then she overcompensates by getting this really frickin' wig. And then at the end, it's discovered that it's a roller skating competition, not an ice skating competition. So I don't know why. I just think that's just, I just love that. I mean, Charles Schulz was very good about taking certain ideas and then running with them until they were, that you could squeeze all the funny out of them that you could. It was kind of like, I don't know, Seinfeld was back in the day. Okay, as I mentioned before, kind of in the 80s, the strip had kind of settled into what it was kind of stayed at. Let's see, there's some things that changed, like Linus and Lucy had a brother named Rerun. Not really much was done with him, but in fact, when he grew up, because all the kids start out as toddlers and they grow up to be Charlie Brown's age, and that's pretty much it. He kind of looked too much like Linus was the problem. I mean, in the 80s when I'd seen him in the comics, I kept thinking he was Linus, but he had a different color shirt. And yeah. Oh, and as I mentioned, Snoopy was revealed to have brothers and sisters, and like Spike was one of them, but not really much was done there. The kids in Charlie Brown's world kind of lived in that world, and I think we were all comfortable with what it was. Okay, now for something that I discovered in my research that Charles Schulz had an affair, and it was with a 25-year-old when he was in his 40s. And he promised to end that affair with his wife, but didn't. In fact, I believe he tried to propose to this one lady and stuff like that. And I'm told there's even strips in the Charlie Brown strip where Snoopy is writing a love letter to somebody, and I believe that is supposed to be symbolic of the infatuation that Charles Schulz had with this one gal. And yeah, Now Charles and Joyce, his wife, did divorce, and he married not that person that he had the affair with, but actually someone else entirely. So yeah, this happened. Just found out about it while I was doing the research. Do I wish I hadn't? Yes, I wish I hadn't discovered this. Does it taint the legacy that Sparky did in his lifetime? I'd say no. There's this... I might do a whole show on this, but you do have to separate art from artists. But it's very difficult knowing that those strips about Snoopy writing to an infatuation that he had, that seems really creepy now. I will have to say that. I'm sure that affected Sparky's family and stuff like that. But I don't want to bring any more shame here because I'm sure that's already been bought. I'd rather talk about the good things that happened during Schultz's lifetime. And now I'm probably going to get into part 5, which is discussing essentially the end of his lifetime.